Hello, everybody. So I did promise that I would give my impressions of Great Expectations once I had actually read it, completed reading it. And so I have, and here are my impressions. I think it's a book about class identity and about the struggles that someone goes through when he leaves the background from which he came and has to try to take on a new social identity. And in a way, it's about trying to pass for a gentleman when you're not a gentleman. And it's a little bit different from what I was talking about being middle class and about having your own business as opposed to someone who is hired by someone else. Um, so Pip could have been a blacksmith and he could have owned his own business. He could have had employees, but none of that in England at that time would have made him a gentleman. Now, Miss Havisham, on the other hand, was considered to be sort of a lady. I don't know to what extent a lady, but apparently her father was a brewer. Uh, he ran a brewery. And at one point, Pip asks, can a person be a gentleman and still run a brewery? And apparently the answer is yes, that is a business that a gentleman can own and run and still remain a gentleman. On the other hand, if he had owned a pub, then in that case, he would not be a gentleman. He would be um, middle class. Uh, Certainly wouldn't be lower class, certainly wouldn't be, riffraff. But it seems to me that the middle class is what is being looked down upon in Dickens, and also another book that comes to mind when I think about that is Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, in which gentlemen are nice people, but people who run, who are landlords, run small businesses are not so nice. And so the lower class and the upper class both look down on the middle class. And yeah, so if you look at somebody like Joe the blacksmith, he's not learned. He obviously speaks dialect instead of posh English, and that's a very big issue. And when Pip wants to learn to become a gentleman, he has to learn how to speak properly. Uh, Apparently, the whole apprenticeship for becoming a gentleman, I mean, he was apprenticed to be a blacksmith, and for a long time, he worked as a blacksmith. And I think that develops your muscles. And then when he received notice that that he had great expectations and someone was leaving him a fortune and wanted to educate him as a gentleman, then he went up to London and he studied under Matthew Pocket, Miss Havisham's relation. And what was he studying? He was reading. I think he was reading the classics. So he was getting an education in the classics, and that was supposed to turn him into a gentleman. In a way, this is already a reduced version of what a gentleman was supposed to be, because it's not a knight in shining armor. It is not someone who goes and fights for the crown and has the right to bear a sword. But it's a later version which says if you're educated, you're a gentleman. But since when is education actually the door to the upper classes? In general, the middle class tended to get a little bit better educated than the upper classes, and the governesses, people like the Brontes, are better educated than the people in the houses where they work. So there's this confusion of the veneer of civilization that comes with having an education and speaking in a posh accent and with posh grammar. That's really not what a gentleman originally was. But one of the issues that Pip has to face is that in order to pass for a gentleman, to pass for somebody in a different class, he has to deny his origins. So he feels very guilty that he's kind of snubbing Joe, the blacksmith, even though he loves him, even though that's his family of origin. He doesn't want his new friends to see him in the company of Joe the blacksmith. And he doesn't want to admit this is the guy who raised him. So there's this kind of this idea that he's adopting a new identity. And in order to have this new identity, he has to forget about his old identity. And this is a thing that in Europe and in England, apparently, there was kind of a mixed feeling about that. On the one hand, it was good to try to elevate yourself and to climb the social ladder. And on the other hand, it wasn't good to try to pass for something that you're not. And today in the United States, with all of the identity politics, that comes up. If somebody comes from a background where they speak local dialect, they might be speaking Black American vernacular at home, and then they go to college and they suddenly sound bone white in their dialect that they've adopted. Other people are going to say that they hate their origins, or that they hate who they really are, and that they're not supposed to try to pass for something that they're not. And there are all these, issues about this. I mean, even for people in the deaf community, somebody can grow up in the deaf community and speak American Sign Language, for instance, and then they might get cochlear implants and want to learn to speak spoken English with a hearing person's accent, and they work on their accent, because deaf people do also have a different way of talking when they do speak out loud. Then other people in the deaf community might feel that they're being shunned, or that this person has tried to pass himself off for something that he's not. So there is that weird feeling in Great Expectations that this is what it's about, that this is like the same thing in Fiddler on the Roof, where if the girl leaves her community of origin and joins a different community, then they have to shun her and they have to pretend that she doesn't exist anymore. That's the other side of the identity politics. So, in this case, he's English. He's never stopped being English. It's just a question of what class Pip belongs to. And so the whole turnaround in the plot is when he finds out that the person who is turning him into a gentleman isn't a gentleman himself. So the escaped convict who turns out to be named Magwitch, Abel Magwitch. He is deported to Australia. At the beginning of the book, I thought, well, he's probably going to be executed. No, they deport him to Australia. He becomes a shepherd. And he makes a fortune herding sheep in Australia. And then the only thing is, he's not allowed to ever set foot in England. And if he does return, it's a death sentence. So, okay, this is so dramatic and kind of silly. The idea that somebody could be deported to another country and end up making a fortune and still want to come back. I would just say good riddance to England if that's how they treated me. But when Pip finds out that it's a deported convict who made his fortune and was turning him into a gentleman, he's not happy about that. What he wanted was for it to be Miss Havisham and for her to be grooming him to be the groom, the husband of the girl that she adopted, Estella, and he wanted to be brought up and raised up in status so that he would be good enough to marry the girl of his dreams. But Estella marries some rich narcissist who beats her up or something like that, doesn't wait for him. And then he finds out, oh my goodness, I'm not being raised to be a gentleman by a gentleman. I'm not being adopted by a gentleman. If anybody knew how I got my money and my education, they would look down on me and I couldn't join the ranks of the gentlemanly people. So he's not happy about this, but he takes care of Magwitch and comes to respect and love him. And eventually his idea is he has to smuggle him out of England and he's going to take him to Hamburg where they could be free. But unfortunately, things don't turn out, and the guy who was involved in the downfall of Miss Havisham, because everything is all connected, of course. So the guy who jilted Miss Havisham and turned her into the bitter old spinster dressed in a wedding dress, that guy was actually working with Miss Havisham's brother, and Magwitch was working under him, and he comes back and he's intent on bringing Magwitch down. So Magwitch tackles him in the water and kills him or something. But anyway, Magwitch is captured and sentenced to death for the terrible crime of having returned to England a rich man. And but he's very sick, and Pip nurses him, and so before the death sentence can be carried out, Magwitch dies. And then Pip is feeling sorry about everything, about turning his back on Joe, turning his back on Biddy, who was the girl he could have married if he hadn't been intent on Estella and being a gentleman. So he comes home and he's all ready to propose to Biddy. But lo and behold, and I could see this coming a mile away, I could see this is what was going to happen. He meets up with Biddy and Joe, And Biddy says, "Oh, look, it's so great that you came. This is my wedding day, and Joe is my husband." Um, okay. So now his plans to marry Biddy and be a blacksmith just disappear. And he goes off to work in Cairo for an accounting firm where his friend Herbert, who is Matthew Pockett's son, is a partner. And so he works there for many years, pays off all his debts, and eventually comes home to England, meets up with Estella, who is newly widowed, and both of them apparently live happily ever after together. Okay, yeah. Not exactly satisfying, this tacked on happily ever after ending. And apparently Dickens had originally intended that Pip would remain single and not very happy for the rest of his life. But that turned out to be not a good enough ending for the publishers or the public. I think that this book is a very good explanation about why people think that identity, social identity, class identity, is so important, and why some people are being reviled for social climbing when all they're doing is, getting an education and learning how to speak the standard dialect, even if they grew up speaking a local dialect. So on the one hand, passing for something that you're not is looked down upon by the liberal establishment. But on the other hand, if you want to change your gender or something like that, it's perfectly okay, because maybe you feel that you were something different to begin with. And apparently Pip felt that he was a gentleman all along, or wanted to be a gentleman, but he had common origins, and he still became a gentleman, because you know what? Even in England, it's possible to better your situation. And social climbing is possible, and social mobility is possible. And when you do this, sometimes you feel a little bit sad about what you left behind. And I would say that, in a nutshell, is the story of Great Expectations. So if you haven't read it, and you wanted to know what it was about, there it is. Thank you very much. And if you liked it, please give a thumbs up and possibly subscribe to this channel, where we talk about literary issues in more